Everyone. So, in both sections of class last week, we had some really good conversations on the rhetorical nature of Frederick Douglass's narrative, and I want to build off of that today. We agreed that it was written for a primarily white audience, mostly people who were already interested in or might be interested in supporting the abolition movement, and that its goal was to encourage people to work toward the abolition of slavery. We also discussed how that particular audience and purpose shaped the decisions Douglass made while telling the story. He shared details that encouraged people to take slavery seriously and to decide to do whatever it was that was in their power to end slavery. But he was also going to tell the story in a way that wouldn't alienate his intended audience. Slave narratives were not uncommon during the period before the abolition of slavery in America or in England. England abolished both the slave trade and slavery slightly before the United States did, and a large part of that movement consisted of stories about slavery and the slave trade that were circulated among abolitionists that were told from the perspective of freed black men, especially. Frederick Douglass was part of a similar effort in the States, and he would even eventually travel to speak to groups of abolitionists about his experience in slavery. Slave narratives were autobiographies, but as we noted, they were autobiographies with a very specific purpose to convince people of the horrors of slavery and to plead with them to work towards its end. Um, to write an autobiography generally, though, does require literacy, and I think that's something we should be mindful of because that's something that we've seen even in Douglass's narrative itself that was usually not available to those who were raised in slavery. Those who did become literate generally often were men. Not that no women did, but the majority were men. According to some studies, even 1 in 5 white women in the southern United States during this time couldn't read. So you think about that gender barrier, and then you add to it, this other much larger barrier. You can imagine how much harder it would be for women in slavery as opposed to men to overcome racial and gendered barriers to education. I bring this up because I want us to be mindful that when we read Frederick Douglass's story, we are reading just one person's experience. Some women did write slave narratives, but most of the ones that have endured are written by men. And one of the things I really like about Douglass's narrative is that it is mindful of its own perspective and the limitations of its own experience. I think that Douglass does go out of his way sometimes to point out how women suffered differently or uniquely, mentioning how people in slavery in states further south may have had different experiences, sometimes harder experiences, especially physically, than those in Maryland. I think he does a really good job trying to tell the story of slavery from his perspective, but in a way that also is aware of the experiences of and perspectives of others. So we're wrapping up Douglass's narrative on Monday, and then for the rest of the week, I want us to think about the aftermath of slavery in the United States. I know high school U.S. history for me was a little bit longer than for a lot of you. I'm thinking it was like almost 2 decades now, which is kind of embarrassing to admit. But from what I remember of my own experience, African American history, at least as told officially in school curriculum, was mostly about slavery, then a few bad things that happened after slavery, and then the civil rights movement, then not much at all after the civil rights movement. Um, if your experience was at all like that, I'm hoping that we can help fill in some of the gaps this week. On Wednesday, I'm going to put together a short article talking about some of the ways that racism, discrimination, and let me find my notes. Racism, discrimination, and systems of taking advantage of Black Americans remained legal for decades after the Civil War ended. Well, I want to note the progress that was made during the Civil Rights movement, and that is something that we will discuss. I also want to be aware of the ways in which, both legally and socially, some of these means of discrimination continue to exist well into the 21st century. I know that for some students, these can be difficult or sensitive topics to discuss in a class. For some, it can be because of past experiences of racism and sensitivity and discrimination. For others, these might be newer topics, at least in the ways that we'll be discussing them in this class, things that may not have been talked about a lot in your high school or in your homes growing up. And for some students, it could be a challenge to know how best to participate in conversations about race. In general, I find that my students tend to be very kind people who do care for one another a lot. But I also want us to be mindful of the fact that we are online. And because we're online, we can't read each other's faces. It can be harder to maintain a dialogue the way that we would in person. So I encourage you to be mindful of how you express yourself in discussion forums, to be gentle in your responses to one another, and to contact me via email if you have any concerns about something you see in a discussion forum. That being said, I am not anticipating any issues over the next few weeks as we discuss this topic, but um, I'd rather be proactive and let you know that there are resources if there is anything that comes up that you'd like to talk about, then fail to mention that. So, looking forward to reading what you have to say on the discussion forums this week. Also, looking forward to talking more on Friday. Have a good week, y'all.